Matthew is going to be talking about the metaphysics of personal identity, and he earned a PhD in philosophy from Cornell. He's a professor of philosophy right now at Bowdoin College. His research has focused on early modern metaphysics and epistemology, and especially on the writings of John Locke. His book, Locke's Metaphysics, came out recently from Oxford University Press, and he is the editor of the forthcoming companion to Locke. So please help me welcome Professor Matthew Stuart.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anouar, and thank you to the Center for inviting me here today. Can you hear me all right? Okay. I'm going to be talking today about the metaphysics of personal identity. And there are a number of questions that fall under the heading of personal identity. Some have to do with how we think about ourselves and with what our deepest values are. Others have to do with the communities we see ourselves as belonging to and with how we've changed as we've grown. And these are ethical and psychological issues about personal identity, I think. And I'm going to be speaking instead about a different sort of question, a metaphysical question about personal identity. My question is one that has preoccupied philosophers for the last 300 years, since the appearance of the second edition of this work, Locke's essay concerning human understanding. The first edition was published in 1690, and a few years after that, Locke was thinking about coming out with a second edition, and he wrote to a friend of his asking for advice about what he might add to it. And the friend, William Molyneux, suggested that he offer some account of identity and individuation. And so Locke added a whole chapter, a longish chapter, and it's one that included a groundbreaking discussion of the topic of personal identity, in particular the issue of personal identity over time, and the question of what it is for a person to persist over time, what it takes for a person at one time to be the same person as a person existing at another time. And he also offered a surprising new answer to the question, and we'll be talking about that a little bit. The metaphysical question about personal identity is the question of what it is in virtue of which a person at one time is identical to a person at another time. This is me on Christmas morning when I was 1.5 years old. And the metaphysician in me asks, what is it in virtue of which I'm the same person as that toddler in that picture? And we need to be a little bit careful in framing the metaphysical question. It's tempting to say, what is it that makes me me? Or what is it that makes me the same person over time? And these questions, I think, are, in the end, incoherent. I couldn't fail to be me. I couldn't be someone other than me. So it doesn't make sense to demand an explanation for why I am me or why I continue to be myself. Now, there are other questions in the neighborhood with which one might confuse those questions. You might ask, why do I exist at all? Or why did my parents have me instead of another kid? Or why do I continue to exist? Those are different questions from what I'm calling the metaphysical question of personal identity. The answers to these questions will be found in my parents' personal history and in my own health and good luck so far. What I'm calling the metaphysical question of personal identity is the question of what it is that makes it the case that a person at one time is correctly identified with a person at another time. And one way to avoid confusion in formulating this question is to appreciate that there are two different ways that we use such phrases as this is the same as that, or this is identical to that. And this is the difference between what philosophers call judgments about qualitative identity and judgments about numerical identity. So sometimes if I say, this is just the same as that, or this is exactly like, this is identical to that, I mean this is exactly like that. So if I've got one freshly minted penny in each hand, I might say, this is just like that. And I might even say, this penny is identical to that one. But I don't mean there's only one penny, I mean that this one is qualitatively just like that one. Similarly, if I say that, my sister and I have the same eyes, I don't mean there's only two eyes and we share them. I mean that, that we've got eyes that are very similar. On the other hand, sometimes we say one thing is identical to, we say X is numerically identical to Y, where we mean X and Y are just one and the same thing, encountered on different occasions perhaps, or picked out by different names. So we say the Unabomber is Ted Kaczynski. So we have, two names or naming terms that are picking out the same individual in the world. Or the watch I'm wearing here is the same watch my dad wore back when I was 1.5. And I don't mean by that that I've went out and found a watch just like the one he had. It's Dad's watch I'm wearing. So that's a claim about numerical identity. And it's possible to have numerical identity in the absence of qualitative identity. Think about the changes that I've undergone since I was in that picture in Christmas in 1967. It's also possible to have qualitative identity in the absence of numerical identity, as in the case of the two pennies. So here are some ways of asking the question that philosophers have been raising ever since Locke published his work, at least, and that I want to talk about today. We could ask, what are the metaphysical criteria for the diachronic identity of persons? That's just a fancy way of saying, what are the criteria for for identifying a person at one time with a person at another time? In virtue of what am I the same person as the kid in that photo? Or you might think, instead of thinking sort of backwards, you might think forwards. You might ask, what has to be true if I'm still to exist in 2020? Another way to approach the metaphysical question of personal identity is to think about what hinges on it. The question of the criteria for personal identity is interesting in its own right, I think, but it's also a question that we've got to answer if we're going to understand whether it makes sense to suppose that there might be life after death. If you claim that there's that you might survive the biological destruction of your body, then you need some account of personhood, in virtue of which you can say that some person existing after your biological demise is the same person as you. So it turns out that there are some accounts of personal identity according to which the very idea of surviving your death is logically incoherent. There are other accounts of personal identity, as we'll see, that allow for the possibility, at least, of life after death. So I don't know if philosophy is going to tell us that there is life after death, but it might at least be able to tell us that there couldn't be life after death. That's the bad news, I suppose. So the best we could hope for, I suppose, is that philosophy might leave the door open. Finally, here's another way to frame the metaphysical question of personal identity. Suppose that a Star Trek transporter works by dissolving the particles that compose your body and either transporting them to the surface of the planet somehow, or perhaps it collects exactly similar particles on the surface of the planet and then arranges them in exactly the same manner as the particles of your body were arranged when you stepped into the transporter. Here's two different ways of thinking about Star Trek transporters. Way number one. It's a fast and easy way of getting from A to B. You step into the transporter thinking that at any minute you're going to find yourself on the surface of the planet. And then while you're still thinking in any minute I'm going to find myself on the surface of the planet, you look around and you are on the surface of the planet. And so on that understanding of the scenario, it's just a nice way to get around. Here's another way to think about Star Trek transporters. The Star Trek transporter isn't a transporter at all, or at least it's not a transporter of people. Even if it transports particles that once constituted your body, or maybe energy that was once mass that once constituted your body, it doesn't transport people and it won't transport you. What it does instead is it destroys people, and then it produces exact replicas of those people at faraway places. On that understanding of a Star Trek transporter, my advice would be don't get into it. So the question is, what does it take for a person at one time to be properly identified with a person at another time? What criteria are we going to give to account for identity across time? And I'm going to consider three sorts of answers to this question. And the first is a very traditional one. So answer number one says that personal identity over time is a matter of the continuity of the soul that at least partly constitutes you. So you might think that, if you're going to give an account of personal identity, you've got to start with what a person is. And a traditional conception of what a person is to suppose that either each of us is a soul, or else each of us is partly constituted by a soul. So there's two different versions of what might be called substance dualism. They both involve the claim that there are bodies, physical bodies, and there are immaterial substances, souls, that are the bearers of psychological states, mental states. So on one version of substance dualism, each of us really just is a soul, and we are, for a time anyway, intimately related to a particular body that we're traveling around in as a kind of vehicle. But the vehicle isn't a part of us. So my relationship to my body on this way of thinking about it is something like my relationship to my Subaru. A little bit more intimate than that, perhaps. But of course, the idea is I could, just as I could exist without my Subarus existing, I might possibly exist without my body's existing. On the other version of substance dualism, the claim is that each of us is partly immaterial and partly material. We're composed of both soul and body. But on the versions of this that I'm acquainted with anyway, defenders of this view also hold the view that although my body, for the time being, genuinely is a part of me, it's something that I could survive the loss of. So substance dualists typically want to be able to say that there could be life after death. You could exist without your body. You could survive the loss of it. Now, there are quite a number of philosophers who don't accept that there are any immaterial substances or souls. And so any such philosopher is going to want to give a different account of personal identity than the one we've just been considering. So answer number two says that personal identity over time is a matter of the continuity of the body that at least partly constitutes you. Now, there are different things you could mean in saying that one is a body and that one's persistence or survival is a matter of the continuity of one's body. You could mean, in referring to a body, just a collection of atoms or particles. And the idea that what it takes for a person to survive over time is just for some particular set or collection of particles to persist or survive is not a very attractive one, right? You don't have to know very much about biology to know that the collection of particles that constitutes you at one moment is likely to be different from the collection of particles that constitutes you a little while later. So a better way of understanding body, in understanding answer two here, is to think of a body as a living body, a human organism that might survive the acquisition and loss of some of its constituent particles. Now, the third possible answer to the metaphysical question that I want to discuss is due to this man, John Locke, and his essay. And his essay, as I said, not only put a bright spotlight on the question. I think there were lots of philosophers before Locke who made assumptions about personal identity, but who didn't treat it as a central topic for philosophers to concern themselves with. Locke did that, but he also offered a very influential and surprising, I think, view. His answer is that personal identity over time is a matter of standing in certain psychological relations to an earlier or a later person. What it is for you to be the same person as some earlier or later person is a matter of the psychological connections between you here now and that earlier or that later person. So if we're to better understand Locke's account of personal identity, we need to begin with his conception of a person. And somewhat surprisingly, he thinks that there's an important distinction to be made between what he calls a man, by which I think he means a human being, means it, I'm thinking charitably here, I guess, as a gender-neutral term, and a person. He thinks there's an important distinction between a man and a person. So as Locke uses the term man anyway, he means a human being, a human organism. Whereas a person, he tells us, is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing, in different times and places. So someone could be a man or a human being without being a person in Locke's sense at all. A newborn baby, which has presumably not yet developed a capacity for self-awareness or the ability to think of itself as a self or something that persists over time, would be a man in Locke's sense, a human being, but not a person. And I suppose if there were Martians who were clever and self-reflective and had concepts of themselves as selves, they would be persons in Locke's sense, but not men, not human beings. Maybe dolphins even are persons in Locke's sense, but not men. So Locke then goes on to give us an account of personhood, and he begins by saying that the notion of personhood is what he calls a forensic notion. He says person is a forensic term, appropriating actions and their merit, and so belongs only to intelligent agents capable of a law and happiness and misery. What he means by this is that our notion of a person is particularly tied up with questions about appropriating actions, tied up with notions of responsibility. So if Locke says that you are the same person as some other, or some earlier existing person or later person, it's to say that that earlier person's actions are your actions. You're to be held responsible for them. That later person's actions are yours. You're to be judged for them. Here's Locke's account of what it is for a person to persist over time, or what it is that justifies us in identifying a person at one time with a person at another time. He says, since consciousness always accompanies thinking, and 'tis that makes everyone to be what he calls self, and thereby distinguishes himself from all other thinking beings, in this alone consists personal identity, i.e. the sameness of a rational being. And as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. His thought here is that it's awareness or consciousness that makes a mental state mine right now, here in the moment, right? So if I'm having a headache, what makes it my headache rather than yours? Well, I'm the one feeling the pain, right? You might have a headache that's just like mine, but your headache is yours and mine is mine. So what makes my headache mine is just my awareness of it, my consciousness of it. And he says what makes a past experience or a future experience mine is also going to be a kind of awareness of it. And he thinks mostly about past experiences. And what he's thinking about is memory, I think. We can see this in this queer passage. He says, had I the same consciousness that I saw the ark and Noah's flood, as that I saw an overflowing of the Thames last winter, I could no more doubt that I that write this now, that saw the Thames overflowed last winter and that viewed the flood at the general deluge, was the same self, than that I that write this am the same myself now whilst I write that I was yesterday. So the idea here is he imagines someone having a memory of seeing Noah's flood, and he thinks it's just intuitively obvious that if you remember seeing Noah's flood, then you had that experience. That was your experience. And you could no more doubt that you were a person who saw the flood than you could doubt that you did whatever you remember doing yesterday. So the view he's describing here is this. He's saying a person existing at one time is the same person as a person existing at an earlier time, if and only if the later person can remember having an experience that was being had by the earlier person, performing some action or having some thought. There are some interesting conclusions or implications of this theory. One, if Locke is right about personal identity, then it is logically coherent to suppose that we could survive our biological deaths. What has to be true if I'm to exist after my biological death? Well, there just has to be a person after that time who has first personal memories of my thoughts and actions. There just has to be a person who remembers having the experiences that I'm having now, say. There are a number of ways one could imagine that being the case. If substance dualism is true, and if there's a God, and we have souls that are the subjects of our mental states, then God might preserve my soul and its memories so that later on there would be a person possessing that soul, perhaps with a new body, but having those memories still, and that would be me on Locke's account. But even if materialism is true, even if we don't have souls, Locke's account of personal identity would allow us to make sense of the possibility of an afterlife. Suppose there's no God, suppose we don't have souls, we're all just collections of particles, but we've got Star Trek-style transporter devices. Then if we could create a Star Trek transporter machine that could, at some later time, create an atom-for-atom copy of each of us after our biological deaths, then we could engineer life after death for ourselves on Locke's account. I think Locke's account of personal identity is designed actually to accommodate the possibility that has this wonderful name, thnetopsychism. It's a bit of vocabulary development for everybody today. Thnetopsychism is the view that the soul dies or perishes at the time of your biological death, but then it comes back into existence later on at the general resurrection. And at the time Locke is living and writing, there was quite a lot of serious debate among Christian theologians about what happens to the soul after death. And there were different views, but one line of thought was called mortalism, and it was the view that you actually go out of existence altogether. Actually, there are several versions of it. There was one called psychosomnolence, I think, where the soul was supposed to continue existing, but to be in a state of deep sleep. And then it got reunited with the body later on and woken up. But thnetopsychism is the view that the soul just goes out of existence altogether. And Locke can accommodate that because he can say even if your soul goes out of existence altogether, if God were to create a new soul later on and to give it memories of your earlier experiences, then that would be you. You would exist after your biological demise. So those are implications of Locke's account of personal identity. Another implication of his account of personal identity, I think, is that you can go right ahead and step into the Star Trek transporter. It's a safe mode of transportation. There is one worrisome implication of Locke's account of personal identity, and I'll talk more about this a bit later on, but unless I remember doing what that toddler was doing and thinking what that toddler was thinking, it looks as though Locke's going to say that I'm not the person in that picture. And that might seem like the wrong result. I think, in fact, Locke does want to say, I'm not the same person as that person in that picture. He might even deny that that guy in the picture is a person. I don't know exactly at what age we decide, we think that, surely, toddlers have some kind of self-awareness. Do they think of themselves as selves that persist over time? Well, the notion of self is a fairly abstract thought. I'll give myself the benefit of the doubt on that score and say that that's a person, but Locke will say, I'm not the same person as that person. I think what he'll do is try to remove some of the strangeness of that claim by adding that although I'm not the same person as that boy, I'm the same human being as that boy. I'm the same human organism or animal as that boy. So remember that for Locke, personhood has chiefly to do with responsibility. And it's not that unintuitive to deny that I'm responsible for the toddler's actions or to deny that that toddler is responsible for any of my actions. Now, so far I've just described the view and I haven't said anything about how Locke argues for it. He does argue for it, and he does so by means of some wonderful thought experiments, which are, one of the tools that are available to philosophers. We can't perform experiments of, the empirical sort to decide the kinds of questions that we want to try to answer, but we can sometimes perform thought experiments. We can imagine situations, see what intuitions they generate, and see what they tell us about the boundaries of our concepts. In this case, we're thinking about the boundary of our concept of a self or a person. So he gives us a number of these wonderful thought experiments. One of them is the case of the prince and the cobbler. He says, "For should the soul of a prince, carrying with it the consciousness of the prince's past life, enter and inform the body of a cobbler as soon as deserted by his own soul, everyone sees he would be the same person with the prince, accountable only for the prince's actions. But who would say it was the same man?" So Locke is presuming substance dualism for the moment. In fact, he's agnostic about whether dualism is true, about whether we have souls. He thinks we probably do, but he wanted to leave the door open to the possibility that God might have bestowed powers of thought upon mere collections of matter by a kind of miracle. So he's presuming for the moment here that substance dualism is true, and he's imagining that the soul of a prince enters the body of a cobbler whose soul has recently departed, presumably without this involving the biological death of the cobbler. The result is a man who looks like the cobbler, right, and who would be identified by his friends and family as the cobbler, but who has the prince's memories and the prince's personality, because it's the prince's soul that's united with his body at the moment. Locke thinks it's just obvious that we'll be inclined to say that the resulting being is the same person as the prince. He'd be, responsible for what the prince had done, and not for what the cobbler had done. But this person, this being, would also be the same human organism as the cobbler. He'd have whatever health problems the cobbler had. And this speaks against those who say that personal identity is a matter of bodily continuity. Right? So this is a kind of argument against one of the alternative answers we've looked at. Here's another thought experiment, or really there's two of them packed into this one passage. This is the case of day man and night man. Could we suppose two distinct incommunicable consciousnesses acting the same body, the one constantly by day, the other by night? And on the other side, the same consciousness acting by intervals two distinct bodies. I ask, in the first case, whether the day and the night man would not be as two distinct persons as Socrates and Plato, and whether in the second case, there would not be one person in two distinct bodies, as much as one man is the same in two distinct clothings. So let's take these one at a time. On the first thought experiment here, he's asking us to imagine something like this. Suppose that in the AM hours, Fred can remember everything that Fred's body was involved in doing, if Fred was awake anyway, in the AM hours yesterday, and in the AM hours the day before yesterday, and the day before that, and so on. So go back as far as you like. In the AM hours, Fred can remember all of the doings of Fred's body, but only in the AM hours. He's got no memories at all about having any experiences in the PM hours. In the PM hours, Fred is just the opposite. Locke thinks that, in the PM hours, Fred has these memories of what he did yesterday afternoon, or what the Fred body did yesterday afternoon, and the afternoon before that, and so on. But he's got no recall at all about what were his body's doings in the morning. Locke thinks that we'll have the intuition that AM Fred and PM Fred are really two distinct persons. Only AM Fred and not PM Fred is responsible for what Fred does in the AM hours. If AM Fred were convicted of murder, say, I think Locke might allow that the just thing to do would be to lock up Fred at midnight each night and then release him at noon each day. Otherwise, you'd be holding another person in jail for a murder he didn't commit. Now, the other thought experiment that's packed into this passage here involves two different bodies sharing the same set of memories alternately. So suppose that Fred's memories of his AM doings all correlate with what Fred's body was doing in the AM hours, but that his memory, in this case, I'm changing the example a bit, he has memories of his PM doings, but those memories all correlate not with what the Fred body was doing, but with what was being done by his neighbor Barney's body in the PM hours. Moreover, in the PM hours, Fred's body calls himself Barney, and Barney's body calls himself Fred and remembers the AM activities of Fred's body, but the PM activities of Barney's body. So what we've got here really, Locke thinks that what we've got here is a case where we've got one person existing alternately in the Fred body in the mornings and in the Barney body in the afternoons, and vice versa for Barney. So if you share Locke's intuitions about this case, this speaks against both the bodily continuity account of personal identity, because Fred's going back and forth just because of where the memories are, but it also speaks against any account that requires continuity of the same soul for personal identity, because here he says nothing about a soul. He's not talking about the soul going back and forth. He's just talking about where the memories are located. All right, one more thought experiment before we turn to some objections. Locke says, let anyone reflect upon himself and conclude that he has in himself an immaterial spirit, which is that which thinks in him, and in the constant change of his body keeps him the same, and is that which he calls himself. Let him also suppose it to be the same soul that was in Nestor or Thersites at the siege of Troy. But he, now having no consciousness of any of the actions of either of Nestor or Thersites, does or can he conceive himself the same person with either of them? Can he be concerned in either of their actions? So imagine that you somehow, authoritatively learned that the soul that's currently partly constituting you and united with your body had been previously used, and used by, some warrior back at the siege of Troy. Of course, all the memories of that soldier's doings have been erased. You've got your memories. Would you think that you just learned that you were this soldier who was back at Troy? I think Locke wants us to have the intuition that no, that wouldn't be the case. Instead, he thinks, I think, you'd feel about it the same way you'd feel if you learned that all of the atoms in your body had been once constituents of some earlier person's body. I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, maybe there's a physicist among us here who can help us with this, but I've heard that it's overwhelmingly likely, and I can't remember how this goes, either that each of us has at least one atom in him that was previously a constituent of Sir Isaac Newton, or at least that each of us at some time or other has one atom in him that was previously a constituent of Sir Isaac Newton. And I ran this by a physicist friend, and he thought it sounded plausible and started telling me about how far and fast the molecules in a teaspoon of water get transmitted around the globe if you drop a teaspoon of water at one shore. So I don't know what the actual facts are here. Philosophers often don't deal with actual facts. We're dealing with imaginary cases. But this is an imaginary case that's meant to show something. What it's meant to show is that if you learned that all of the atoms in your body had previously constituted Sir Isaac Newton at some time. Indeed, imagine that all of the atoms that currently constitute your body right now were at some one time constituents of Sir Isaac Newton's body, say in 1687. Would that be tantamount to saying that you were Sir Isaac Newton? Well, no, it'd be curious, it'd be a neat thing to learn, right? But it wouldn't make you think that you're the same person as Sir Isaac Newton. So you'd be composed out of the same stuff as previously composed him. Similarly, you might think of a lump of clay that could be used successively by different artists. And so it could successively constitute different statues, right? We could have an arrangement, where one artist uses this lump of clay to make a statue, and we're going to keep it on display for a month, and then the next artist gets his crack at it, and it makes a different statue. So we'd have, one quantity of material stuff composing distinct statues, and what Locke wants to say is that you could have, a persisting, surviving soul that successively constituted different people. So that's the view, that it's memory connections and not continuity of soul or persistence of body that makes it the case that you are the same person as some earlier existing person. Now the view is, I think, subject to a number of objections, and critics have complained both that it's too demanding an account of personal identity and that it's too lax. So it's been complained both that he sets the bar too high and that he sets the bar too low. I'll take the too demanding objection first. This is the view that Locke doesn't leave room for the possibility, say, that we might sometimes forget some of what we've done, right? It seems obvious that we sometimes forget some of what we've done. In fact, if you imagine going through life, never forgetting anything, I think that would be pretty horrible, right? I mean, I'd like my memory to be a little bit better than it is, but not that much better. But Locke seems to be requiring that for an action to be in my past, I have to be able to remember it. And if I can't remember it, then I didn't do it. I'm not the same person as the person who did it, right? And this objection was made, if not during Locke's lifetime, it was made most famously not long afterwards by the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid in the early 18th century. He made this charge that Locke's account of personal identity is too demanding and that it doesn't allow for the possibility of forgetting. And he did so with a thought experiment of his own that is now much talked about still among philosophers, and it's the case of the brave officer. He tells a story. He says, imagine that there is a naughty schoolboy who steals apples from an orchard and gets caught and gets flogged for it, a fairly humiliating experience. He manages to grow up into a good, upstanding citizen anyway, and goes in the military and turns out to be a very brave officer and steals the enemy's standard in battle, and is rewarded for that afterwards. And in fact, gets promotions and ends up being a general later on. And then we're asked to imagine that while he was a brave young officer, he could still remember his embarrassment about the flogging at school. But by the time he's a doddering old general in the old general's home, though he can still remember his wartime exploits, so he remembers his doings as a brave officer, he can no longer remember the unpleasant memory of the flogging at school. Locke's account, says Reid, seems to give us a contradiction then, because on the one hand, it tells us that the old general is not the same person as the boy who got flogged for stealing the apples, right? Because he can't remember that experience. But it also tells us that he is identical to, he is the same person as the young officer, and that the young officer is the same person as the boy who got the flogging. But of course, identity is transitive, right? If A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C. And so Locke's account seems to give us this impossible result, this contradiction. One way that many defenders of Locke have responded to the brave officer case is to offer what they consider a friendly amendment to Locke's account. So they concede that his account won't work as it stands. It falls victim to the objection. But they think that it could be modified in a way that's still in keeping with the spirit of it, and thus sort of work around the objection. So some scholars suggest that we should say that a person is the same person as an earlier existing person so long as there's a chain of memories that takes us back to that person. So I can't remember what I had for lunch, exactly 3 months ago, but I can remember what I had for lunch yesterday, and if yesterday I could remember what I had for lunch the day before that, and so on, and if that chain of memories takes me back to the guy, eating lunch 3 months ago, then on this sort of modified Lockean memory account of personal identity, we could say that I am the same person as that guy eating lunch 3 months ago. So it's not memory connectedness, it's not my remembering the earlier event, that's too demanding a requirement, but it's memory continuity. It's a matter of there being these intermediate steps. So that's a move one could make. I think that, in fact, Locke would rather bite the bullet here. And I think if he, had lived long enough to be confronted with Reid's objection, and Reid says, but you're telling me, that this, this old general isn't the same as the boy who got the flogging, I think he'd say that's not an objection, that's my theory. But I think that he could do this only because he defends a view called the relativity of identity, and that gets us into deep waters that I think I want to avoid this evening. So I think that he would rather bite the bullet, and he would say that that your past as a person is one thing, and your past as a man or a human animal is another thing. So I think what he would want to say is that the old general is no longer the same person as the boy who did the flogging, but he is the same animal. So that's like what he'd want to say about me and the 1.5-year-old in that picture then. Another way of raising this objection that Locke's account of personal identity sort of makes too strong a requirement for what it takes for a personal identity over time is to think about the toddler case. Was I ever a toddler? Well, on Locke's account, if I can't remember any toddler's actions from the inside, from the first personal point of view, then I was never a toddler, which raises the question of, when did I come into existence anyway? And if my earliest memory is, 4 years old or so, as I think it is, that's when I came into existence. And that does raise a puzzle about, well, what about that, what about the kid that my parents had named Matthew and were taking care of when he was 3? And Locke's account, I think, will be that I'm the same animal as that 3-year-old, but I'm not the same person. So I think Locke has the resources to respond to this objection that his account is overly demanding. The next problem, I see we've got 1 and 1 here. That was meant to be 1 and 2, of course. The next problem seems to me more difficult for him. And in fact, I think his account in the end does not work, and because of this. I think he faces serious problems when it comes to the possibility of misremembering, of false memories. So Locke's account would, on the surface, seem to imply that if I remember doing something, I did it. And yet, it seems obvious that sometimes people misremember, think they did something, you think you turned the burner off and you didn't. And so we need to allow for that possibility. Another way to press the same objection is to think about how Star Trek transporters might malfunction. Suppose that instead of creating one atom-for-atom copy of Captain Kirk down there on the surface of the planet, the device creates 2 atom-for-atom copies of Kirk down there on the surface of the planet. The 2 copies wouldn't be identical with one another, right? They'd be standing next to one another, so you couldn't say this is the same person as that, or it doesn't seem very plausible anyway. Yet each of them would have memories of all of the same actions, experiences that Captain Kirk had previous to beaming down. And so we seem to get the result that having those memories then doesn't suffice for being identical to Captain Kirk, because you can't have 2 distinct persons, each of them identical to one and the same earlier Captain Kirk. I think that what Locke needs is to make a distinction between really remembering something and merely seeming to remember something. He needs a distinction between genuine memories and mere apparent memories. Then he needs to go on to say, well, when I say that you are the same person as whoever performed the actions you remember performing, he's got to say that I meant genuine memories, not mere apparent memories. And that means we need to give some account of the difference between genuine memory and mere apparent memory if his theory is to work. And there is a very straightforward answer to the question, what's the distinction between genuine memories and apparent memories? It goes like this. If I seem to remember an earlier experience, I have a genuine memory only if I did have the experience. Otherwise, it's a mere apparent memory. I hope that looks a little bit fishy to you. It's an answer that I think, it's a perfectly sensible answer to the question of the distinction between, genuine memory and apparent memory, but it's one that's not available to Locke in this context. Because he's trying to explain identity over time in terms of memory connections. So if he then goes on to explain what memory is by helping himself to identity over time, he'll be just reasoning in a circle. So he needs some other way to account for the difference between genuine memories and mere apparent memories. And the obvious strategy, I think, is to look at how ordinary veridical memories, the kind of memory that, that I have of what I had for lunch yesterday, are causally connected to the experience that they're memories of. I think the way to cash out a distinction between genuine memories and mere apparent memories that doesn't presuppose personal identity is to say that there is some difference in the sort of causal connections between the genuine memory and the event remembered and the mere apparent memory and the event apparently remembered. And the problem is, the difficulty is to say, well, what sort of causal connection is it that's required? Because you can't simply say that, well, there's got to be some causal connection. There might be cases of false memories, I suppose, where you falsely remember some earlier event. The earlier event, say, actually happened, but there's no causal connection whatever between you remembering it and the events occurring earlier. It's just a total fluke. I suppose that's possible, but there are going to be lots of other, probably actual cases, but certainly imaginable cases in which there's some kind of causal connection, but not the right sort of causal connection. So think about this case. You might look at a picture of some event that took place long ago, some event that you were not a witness to, and then you might later fabulate that you were actually a witness. You might forget that you'd looked at the picture, or maybe you thought that the picture just confirmed that you'd been there. So you might later seem to remember having witnessed the event, but the image you've got in your head is really the consequence of your looking at that picture and not the consequence of your actually having been there when the event occurred. That seems to me, probably actually happens, certainly imaginable case. So there, in that case, you'd be falsely remembering having the experience of witnessing the event, but there would be some causal connection between you and the event because, of course, the photograph exists because of some causal connection between it and the event. The photographer who took it was around at the time of the event, it was a witness. And then there's some causal connection between your apparent memory and the photograph. So what we need to do is to think about what sort of causal connections there are in cases of real, genuine memories, and what distinguishes those cases from the cases where we've got a mere false memory. And there are a couple of possibilities that occur to me, and one of them involves the notion that what we do when we remember something involves our souls. So really what it comes to here is the account that we're going to give of memory is going to be related to our philosophy of mind, to our view about what we are and what are the subjects of our mental states. So here's an account one could give. You could say, if I seem to remember an earlier experience, this counts as a genuine memory only if it's the result of traces the experience left upon my soul. So the case where you had the false memory because you looked at the picture, the traces would have been left in your soul by the picture and not by the event depicted. The trouble with this as an attempt to help Locke out here is that on the first hand, it presupposes that we've got souls, and as I mentioned earlier, he wants to remain agnostic about that. And the other problem with it is that it makes judgments about personal identity epistemically problematic. And what I mean by that is it makes them, it threatens our grounds for claiming that we know that somebody, say, is a person we met earlier. So suppose that your genuine memories are those that are the result of traces left in your soul by the remembered event, and that personal identity requires genuine memories. In that case, personal identity requires persistence of the same soul, right? And here's a problem. It's actually not just a problem for this attempt to help out Locke. I think it's a problem for substance dualism altogether, a problem for the view that we are even partly constituted by souls. It's this. If you think that persistence of the same soul is necessary for personal identity, how do you ever know that you re-encounter someone? Because all you get a look at when you meet, someone who someone you judge to be, your wife who you saw, a few minutes ago, or your friend who you saw last week. How do you know that there's the same soul animating that body? You can't observe the soul. You can't track it. All you're acquainted with, all you're directly experiencing is the body, right? And seems possible in principle that a body should be animated by a different soul every 5 minutes or every 5 days or whatever. And then as long as it's loaded with the same collection of memories and the same personality traits, you wouldn't be able to tell, right? All you get access to is the body and how it behaves, the things it says, and the things it can remember doing. In fact, it's not really just a problem about making judgments about other people's persistence over time. It works when you think about your own persistence. How do you know that you've got the same soul that animated your body 5 minutes ago? Maybe every 5 minutes we get a brand new soul packed with all the same collection of data, the same memories, same parent memories. It'd be like, the hard drive gets replaced every 5 minutes, but the same data is put on it. How can we rule that out? Have we got any grounds at all for supposing that so long as we've got the same memories or the same collection of personality traits, same musical tastes and same sense of humor, that you're dealing with the same immaterial substance at the bottom of it all? So I think that's a problem. It's a problem for substance dualism, and it's a problem for the attempt to lean on substance dualism in order to save Locke's account. And so I think he wouldn't be happy with this at all. So I turn to another possible solution, which unfortunately I think he wouldn't be happy with either. A different account of what it is that's the distinction between a real memory and a mere apparent memory is this. If I seem to remember an earlier experience, this constitutes a genuine memory only if it's the result of traces the experience left on my brain. So you might say that my memory is genuine just in case it's stored in my brain by virtue of changes that occurred in my brain or that were caused in my brain by the events remembered back when they occurred. Right? So that'll allow us to explain the difference between my genuine memory of eating lunch yesterday and the false memory of the case we were talking about earlier, where you have a memory because of a picture you saw rather than because of your presence at the events depicted in the picture. So we get to distinguish the cases of genuine memories from the case of the false memories adequately. In fact, I think this is the way to go, but it makes memory connection depend on brain continuity, and presumably it therefore makes memory continuity depend on biological continuity, after all. And that wasn't Locke's view. Locke was looking for an alternative to both the idea that a person persists over time because of the persistence of the soul or because of the organism. So I'm going to finish up by describing what is an alternative to Locke's account and the one that I favor. And it's called animalism. Animalism says that what I am, and this is going to be true for each of you as well, is an animal. Someone existing at an earlier or later time is me if and only if that person is biologically continuous with me. That is, only if that being participates in the same biological life. So what we are as animals, and judgments about personal identity should really be made on the basis of biological connections or biological continuity. So Locke actually does give an account of the identities of organisms, thinking of organisms that aren't persons. And when he does that, he gives just this account of what it takes for an organism to persist. He thinks of a life as a complex set of processes, a series of metabolic interactions, and what it is for me to be the same kid as that kid in the picture is for me to be involved in the same ongoing set of metabolic processes of a sort that the process would be describable by a scientist better than a philosopher. Now, there is the distinction that we talked about earlier between a man and a person, and you might say that the animalist is giving an account of what it is to be a human organism, a man in Locke's sense, rather than an account of what it is to be a person in Locke's sense. And I think that's about right. But that the animalist should invoke a certain distinction. This is a distinction introduced by the philosopher David Wiggins, a distinction between substance terms and phase sortals, between what you might call substance concepts and phase sortal concepts. So here's the idea. There are some concepts that apply to a thing necessarily for all of its existence. And there are other concepts that might apply to a thing just for a portion of its existence. And equally, we could speak of some words being applicable to a thing for all of its existence, and other words being applicable to it only for a portion of its existence. So human being is, in this sense, a substance term, or the concept of a human being is a substance concept. The only way to stop being a human being is to go out of existence altogether, right? If you were to cease to be a human being, you would cease to exist. But if you think about a student, there's two ways to stop being a student, right? You could be hit by a bus and then the world is -1 student. Or you could graduate and the world is, in a much happier way, -1 student. So being a student is a phase of being a person that one might be in for a time, but that one might survive even if one was no longer in the phase. And what the animalist can say about the Lockean distinction between man and person then is this. Person's a phase sortal. At present, I'm an animal that's also a person in the Lockean sense, that is, a being that's reflective, that's self-conscious, that thinks of itself as a self that persists over time. So I'm a person, you're all persons, I'm an animal, you're all animals. But I might cease to be a person. I might cease to qualify for personhood. In fact, I earlier failed to qualify for personhood. Maybe not when I was 1.5, but when I was a newborn, I certainly wasn't having self-conscious thoughts about my, doings the previous day or about my persistence over time. So I was once a non-person human organism. I became a person at some point. With any luck at all, I'll remain a person for the rest of my days. But it's possible that, I will cease to be an intelligent, reflective being without ceasing to exist. I might continue to breathe and respire and carry on the metabolic processes that are required for personal identity according to the animalist. So that's an alternative to the Lockean view and one that I myself favor. I think I'll stop there and then take any questions you've got. Yes.
Yes.
I guess we've got a mic coming here.
Yes, I don't know if I'm going to be able to phrase this correctly, but how would we account for a multi-personhood that is established by dreamlike state and subconscious states intermixing with what we actually experience? And how does that, borrowing from history and looking forward to the future, construing it in some way, doesn't that transcend the physical body, the being, the material body itself, and the experiences of that material body? So how would Locke account for experiences that are not actually the material experience of the body?
Well, for starters, Locke is officially agnostic about whether we are even partly immaterial. So he wants to leave the door open, and he got a lot of flack for this in his day, as you might imagine. He wants to leave the door open to the possibility that we are just wholly material, that we don't have souls even. And in part, I think his motive in offering the account of personal identity that he does is it's one that allows him to preserve the Christian doctrine of the resurrection, even if we were to be wholly material. So that's the first part. You made reference to sort of subconscious thoughts. About that, Locke would deny that there are any. Locke didn't believe that it could be right to attribute to or ascribe to a person any thoughts that she wasn't conscious of. So there'd be a big disagreement there between Freud and Locke, of course.
So those thoughts aren't involved with that personhood.
Well, I mean, it could be that you have dreams, and having dreams is having experiences. They might not be veridical experiences. They may not present the world as it really is, but they're real experiences. right? And if you later remember those experiences, if you remember your dreams, then Locke could say that you are the same person as had those experiences, those dream experiences, just in case you remember them. So he'll say that much, yeah.
Right. Thank you very much,
Yeah,
and
sure.
I appreciate what you've delivered.
Thank you. Yes, back there.
Yeah, I have. Hold it right up. Okay. Yeah, I have two questions, but I'll try to wrap them up in one scenario.
Okay.
A group of siblings has an elderly parent with a progressive dementia. And as often the case, the siblings at one point will say, "Mother just isn't in there anymore."
Yeah.
So the biological entity is continuing, but would that mean that that she's no longer a person or a different person? And the second
Yep.
part of the question is, the siblings might share lots of memories of that person over their lifetime. Does the collective memories of an individual on the part of other people constitute the persistence of the person, despite the fact that this person may be demented or may be dead?
Yeah, those are both really good questions. I'll take them in order. So the first question, Locke will say that that if the parent really has lost all of her memories of previous portions of her life, then she's the person. If there is a person there still, that person is not the same person as as the one who raised the children, say. So yeah, he'll say that, and so his theory accords with, I think, an intuition a lot of people have when they say that this is no longer the person. I might be still attached for and I feel some obligation to care for this being, but it's not the person that I remember. Actually, Locke might have some difficulty there in accounting for the sense that we have that one might still have a moral obligation to care for an agent parent in that condition, because presumably you have that obligation, in part because this is the person who raised you and cared for you when you were unable to care for yourself. That's the thought, anyway. The other question was about whether other people's memories of your thoughts and actions might somehow constitute your persisting self, even when you're not any longer having these first personal memories. I don't think Locke considered anything like that. He doesn't spell this out as carefully as he might, but I think that when he talks about extending one's consciousness backward to an earlier thought or action, he's thinking, you've got a first personal memory of having done that, having been there, having had that thought. So I think he would probably say that it was, merely a manner of speaking when we say that a person lives on in our hearts, and it's not literally true. Yes.
So off of the previous question, do you leave any room for the evolution, or does the idea of relegating transitive identities, so if A equals B and we would not get to B without A, but then B leads into C, we only remember B and C, does that make us no longer A in addition? So the idea of the brave officer who eventually has forgotten the flogging, which has enabled the brave officer, but now can remember that act, but perhaps not the courage which enabled them to create it. Would they still be the same person, like who in stage A, or is the idea of relegating that to phase sortals, saying that we as animals progress through an evolution of various personhoods rather than evolve a single personhood?
Yeah, well, so there's the question of what Locke would say, I suppose, and the question what I would say, and I'm not entirely sure which of those you meant, but I think Locke will say that the old general is not the boy who did the flogging. He's not the same person as the boy who once did the flogging. So you might have thought that your past can only get longer, right? And that your past is continuous. So you might think that you've existed since the moment you were born, the moment you were conceived, and all for every moment between then and now you existed, and you might think that your past can only grow. But on Locke's view, as I understand it, your past can shrink by virtue of your forgetting things, and moreover, I think he thinks your past can be gappy. You could be the same person as a person who existed 2 weeks ago, but then not be the same person as any person who existed 3 weeks ago, and yet be the same person as someone who existed 2 years ago. So your past can be gappy. He wants to say that about personhood. About the human organism, I think he does mean to say there that your existence must be continuous and your history can only get longer until it ends altogether.
If somebody were to live in a way that they lived in different psychological states, if they were to have a disorder,
Yes.
and that person were to commit a crime, and then it was to be determined that that crime was committed in a psychological state that they weren't aware of, then would Locke say that they were responsible for that crime? Or
Yeah, that's terrific. And there are these real life cases of what is sometimes called multiple personality or dissociative disorder, and I think it's sometimes difficult to tell exactly what's going on in such cases. But if you could clearly establish that we had a case that was analogous to his day man, night man, I mean, likely it wouldn't be quite so neat, right? It wouldn't be just the AM hours and the PM hours. But if you could clearly establish that there really was more than one personality and that they were taking turns and that the memories of the one really didn't overlap with the memories of the other, then yeah, Locke would say you've got two or perhaps more persons inhabiting the same body. And again, that raises the problem about if you thought that punishment was requisite, then the question, how would you punish one of them without punishing all of them? He talks about a case. He doesn't talk about that case, but he talks about the drunkard who is blacked out and can't remember some bad thing he did while he was very drunk. And if he complains that he genuinely can't remember doing it, Locke realizes one will raise the objection. Well, then you got to let the guy go, right? And that doesn't seem right. That you should let someone go just because they blacked out after they did the bad thing. But Locke, and you might think that Locke's reply would be, well, you made the responsibility to drink in the first place, and so even though the drinking caused the memory failure, that's why you're not to be excused for it. In fact, that's not Locke's answer. He thinks if you couldn't remember it, you're really not to be punished for it. It's just that we can't really know when people say they can't remember if they can't remember. So if it were God looking into the person's soul could tell that there really was no memory there, then he thinks you have to let him go. He's not the person who did it.
Hi, yeah. So in thinking about these cases and like what drives the intuitions for whether people are the same, the memory is somewhat compelling, right? But then you get these other examples where there's so in one of my classes, a student brought up the case where, this poor guy who's I guess he's still alive. I think he was a music critic or something, and he can only remember 5 minutes, and then he forgets everything.
Yeah.
Right. So, so every time he sees his wife, he thinks he hasn't seen her in months or something. I don't know exactly how that works, but I mean, intuitively, we do think that's the same guy. I think we think, yeah, that's the same guy. We don't think it's a new person every 5 minutes. I mean, that seems pretty weird. It seems like it's just the same guy, and something really terrible has happened to him. Mm-hmm. Maybe not everybody has that intuition, but I guess what I'm really wondering, and this is you as a Locke scholar, because I don't know that much about what's driving Locke, but the idea that it's the personality. So when I think what connects a person, there's bodily continuity, and then there's memory, and then there's personality features, your sense of humor, all your dispositions to certain character traits. So why did Locke? I wonder if you have, why did Locke focus on memory like that and not personality, which I think it's another possible route.
That's a really good question, right? I think he focused on memory because he's got this general principle that what makes an experience yours is your consciousness of it, and he thinks that that's true in the present. What makes my thoughts mine is my conscious awareness of them, and that's why he thinks that there couldn't be unconscious thoughts. If I'm not aware of it, then it doesn't pass the test for being mine. And he thinks of my remembering an earlier event as a kind of awareness or consciousness of it that's akin to my awareness of my current thoughts. But I agree that if you were attracted to the spirit of Locke's position and wanted to offer a kind of, contemporary neo-Lockean account of personal identity, the idea of supplementing it by saying that it's not just memories, it's personality that plays a bigger role in it. So you might, I don't know quite how you'd do this exactly, but you might say that part of what it is to be the same person as an earlier person is not just to remember his doings, but if not have, people can change, so it's not that you have to have exactly the same sense of humor or, exactly the same taste, but your personality would at least have to be presumably the product of whatever process had gone on between then and now. Yeah, so I can see the traction of it, but I think Locke didn't consider it.
Right.
One there and one there.
Yes, thank you. What do you think about, when I attended this lecture, I'm thinking Nietzsche's quote, in every grown man there's an inner child that still wants to play, a little boy that still wants to play. I'm not getting the quote right. So when you think of men and women and the dichotomy between Locke and Nietzsche, what are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious because that's what I was kind of coming into this lecture with, is that we all have this inner child in us, that we're just larger versions of a child. And I'm a therapist, so I work a lot with folks who, have that struggle between still wanting to have those childlike ways.
Yeah.
What would Locke, just out of curiosity, because you're an expert on Locke, what do you think about that?
I don't know what he would think about that exactly. He might well, be able to allow that some of what motivates you is, the product of your childhood, and he certainly can allow that there might be deep and basic features of your personality or your drives that were evident when you were a child and are still at work, although in different ways now that you're an adult. I think he could allow for all that, but he would say that the connection between the current adult and that earlier child had to be grounded in memory connections. And I'm not sure that we'd find that view all that plausible in light of what we've learned about childhood development since then, right? It seems to me that it might be plausible to say that there are lots of events in one's childhood that one might repress or might not have paid much attention to or might not remember anyway, that could still be playing a fairly big role in making us who we are now. Yeah.
So would Locke give identity to animals, and would he also give it to contemporary computers?
Well, let's see. So the case of animals, he certainly allows that we can make judgments about identity. That the dog I walked this morning is the same dog I walk every morning, and he'll account for that in the way that the animalist will account for my identity by saying, well, it's the same organism, it's participating in the same life processes. But maybe you meant to be asking whether non-human animals could count as persons for him. They could, but they'd have to be special non-human animals, right? My dog, has some sense, I think, of time. Certainly, she knows when it's time for her chew or time to go for a walk. But does she have thoughts of the sort of self-reflective sort? That was me doing that yesterday, or I remember doing the. I don't know. I don't know how you'd tell. So you'd need something like that for the dog to count as a person for Locke. And about artifacts, machines, it would depend on whether you could build one that was conscious. If you could build one that was conscious, then it might well be a person. But in fact, Locke thinks you couldn't build one that was conscious. He thinks the only reason that we might be machines ourselves that think is because he thinks that it might be within God's power to super add powers of thought to us, to mere mortal flesh.
You used a word, or there was
and the word was consciousness.
Yeah.
And what role did it play in his thinking, or did it not play at all? I mean, consciousness is kind of an interesting word. I'll relate a story of my own daughter about the notion of artificial intelligence, and she was 10 years old. She came up to me and said, "Daddy, what is artificial intelligence?" And I said, "Well, you know what it is? It's kind of like, you know how Daddy makes programs and he writes code? He says it's kind of like the machine begins to write its own code. And that might be artificial intelligence." She said, "Oh, no, that's not true." She said something, and I don't think she really realized what she said. She said, "I think artificial intelligence is when a computer comes to know what it is to be." Now, for a 10-year-old to say that,
That's pretty good, yeah.
I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah.
But it spoke to the notion of consciousness. And if you think about consciousness as person, if you take a newborn, and you were talking about when is it that a person becomes a person,
Yeah.
a newborn is actually capable of distinguishing between light and a human face. If you take a light, you pass it across, and I've done this as an experiment as a pediatrician, they won't follow it. But if you take the human face, and what I do in this case is move my face across, they will follow it. Is that baby conscious of the difference, that there is some meaningful difference between the two? But back to the notion of consciousness, I'm wondering if it's not so much the continuity of memory or past memory, but as the continuity of consciousness that begins at some time based on a biological substance, and then it moves forward, and that's the continuum.
Yeah. I think Locke would definitely allow that the baby's conscious. The baby has experiences. That's not much in doubt. But it's not mere consciousness that's required for personhood on his view, right? So it has to be, in order to qualify as a person for him, you've got to not only be aware, having experiences, but you've got to be able to think about yourself. It requires self-consciousness for personhood. And, whether the newborn baby has self-consciousness seems another matter.
Well, what we see beginning around 6 or 7 months is a baby becomes to understand separation. What we think is happening in the first few months is the baby looks at their mother as simply an extension of themselves. And then in the second 6 months, you begin to see the separation, and that's where the separation anxiety begins to happen.
Yeah, right.
And you get the 7 and 8 and 9-month-old who wakes up in the middle of the night, wants you.
Yeah.
And part of the theory of that actually came out of the 19th century was that the consciousness of separation, that I am an entity separate from my mother, begins to dawn around that time period.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's as late as that, actually. I remember my own daughter at one point, very early on, she's just a few days old, being frightened by her hand because she didn't seem to, the way I judged it, it looked like she didn't think it was a part of her. It was like an alien thing moving into view, So, yeah, there's some point at which the baby makes a distinction between self and other, but then there's yet another step of, thinking about oneself. Yeah.
We have a question online
Okay.
from George Young. He's very well known in the center. So the question is, what do you mean by animal? Is it a strictly material biological entity, a being without anima, or does it include something immaterial? And if so, how does that differ from the categories of humanness and personhood animal is intended to replace?
Yeah, right. Okay. I guess you could think of this as a question for Locke or as a question for me. If it's a question for Locke, then I think Locke is willing to allow for the possibility that animals have souls, but not that they have the kinds of self-reflective abilities that we have. So Locke would allow, I think, that animals might have souls for all we know. Just different sorts of souls, or souls bestowed with different kinds of abilities. Now, on the kind of animal that I've got in mind when I talk about animalism as a theory of personal identity, I'm presuming that animals are wholly material, but again, that they come in different shapes and sizes and with different abilities. So I'm an animal, but my yellow lab is an animal, and my yellow lab, doesn't and won't ever likely answer to the phase sortal person, but I didn't for a while, do now, and might or might not continue doing so.
Okay.
Hello? Oh. Hi. When I think of Locke, I think of someone who's had a profound influence on legal, political culture, political history.
Yeah.
Someone who's incredibly, we can make use of. And I'm wondering, what was his goal did he have a goal in applying this in the real world the way we could apply so many of his other writings?
Yeah.
And if he did not, what do you think could be the applicability of these ideas?
Well, so Locke is probably known, first and foremost as a political thinker. And his great political work, the two treatises, it's the second treatise that gets all the attention, was published in the very same year as the essay concerning human understanding. He'd been working on both of them for a long time, though. And there are these sort of two sides to Locke. He was a very practical political man and thinker, but I think he was also seriously interested in these metaphysical questions that didn't always have a practical implication. People who read the essay tend to think of him as an epistemologist, as a theorist who's giving an account of knowledge. He's sort of the granddaddy of empiricism. He's the first of the great British empiricists. But this was sort of the overarching thesis of my book, Locke's Metaphysics. Every time he gets in the neighborhood of a metaphysical question, he just can't resist saying something about it, and sometimes he gushes on for 30 pages about it. He was a real amazing polymath with a lot of interests. I think to him this question about personal identity had perhaps a more obvious sort of, not practical, but a more obvious importance than maybe it does to some of us now because of the issues about surviving the destruction of the body, right? He's a committed Christian and wants to allow for the possibility that the Christian doctrine of the resurrection is true, but also wants to reconcile his Christianity with what he knows about the emerging mechanistic science of his day. And so this theory about personal identity, as abstract as it may seem, allows him to accept even a materialist account of ourselves in some mechanism, but also to retain traditional Christian doctrines.
So one can stop being a student and still remain 100 different things.
Sure.
And so now I have one question in answer to your conclusion. Can one be a person first before being an animal?
Well, if there might be Martians that don't qualify as animals, but that would be persons. If we manage to build a conscious machine, then it would be a person, but perhaps not an animal. So yeah, I think you could be. But the persons we're acquainted with were all animals first.
And how do you know that?
Well, to my knowledge, we've not built any artificial ones, and the biological ones are animals from the get-go.
Is it all knowledge socially constructed? Even our perception of what animalism is?
I guess no. I don't think that all knowledge is socially constructed.
Because the moment you begin to think about stuff, including your initial state of being, which is the animal phase,
yeah,
you're already drawing from a body of knowledge, a repertoire, which is socially determined, about which you had no choice. So you're thinking, I'm making some comparison with the Cartesian method with Descartes a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then I'm using, I don't know whether you're familiar with a medieval Muslim philosopher by the name of Al-Ghazali.
Heard the name, but
yeah, it's very interesting. So he, in the 12th century, had the antithetical response to Descartes' notion, I think, therefore I am. Mm-hmm. And he said, I think, therefore I have a problem. Because he can't, well, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah,
because
I figured.
Because the notion there was The moment you start thinking about stuff, it's too late to go back to some state of tabula rasa that people think they assume they had before they became socially or culturally conscious.
Yeah.
So to me, it's not totally impossible that our notion of animalism or of animal state is a condition of our personhood the way you define it.
Well, I guess I would want to say that you could be an animal without having the concept of an animal. So even if our concept of animal is a social construction, I don't suppose that my dog Phoebe has the concept of an animal. I mean, I suppose she can distinguish living things from non-living ones. Maybe that's all it takes. But you could, I think, certainly pick a simpler organism. A slug would be an animal without the concept of an animal.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.